Welcome to episode 6 of QUILTSIDE Chats. Brought to you by American Quilt Study Group. The American Quilt Study Group establishes and promotes the highest standards for interdisciplinary quilt-related studies, providing opportunities for study, research, and the publication of works that advance the knowledge of quilts and related subjects. In partnership with the International Quilt Museum at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The International Quilt Museum's mission is to build a global collection and audience that celebrate the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. And sponsored by Quilt Folk, a quarterly keepsake magazine of, by, and for quilters. QUILTSIDE Chats are a series of lively conversations between Carolyn Ducey, International Quilt Museum Curator of Collections, and an American Quilt Study Group member featuring the quilt that she or he would sneak out of the building if it weren't a crime. Merikay Waldvogel is a nationally known quilt historian with more than 40 years of research culminating in numerous published articles, books, and exhibits. It all began in Chicago, Illinois, where she bought her first quilt in 1974. After moving to Tennessee, she co-directed the Quilts of Tennessee Quilt Survey. In 1990, she wrote Soft Covers for Hard Times, Quilt Making and the Great Depression. In 1993, Merikay and Barbara Brackman co-wrote Patchwork Souvenirs of the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, a highlight of both their careers. Carolyn Ducey is Curator of Collections at the International Quilt Museum, a position she has held since 1998. She oversees acquisition and management of the IQM collection of more than 8,500 quilts. Ducey earned an MA in American Art History from Indiana University in 1998 and her PhD in Textiles, Clothing, and Design with an emphasis in quilt studies at the University of Nebraska in 2010. She is co-editor of American Quilts in the Industrial Age, 1760 to 1870, published in 2018, and a co-author of What's in a Name? Inscribed Quilts, published in 2012. And now, let's cozy up to the quilt.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi, Merikay. I'm so excited to be here today with you. We have a really fascinating topic, and we're going to talk a lot about Chicago. And I saw in the intro, I didn't know you bought your first quilt in Chicago, Merikay. It's kind of full circle for you, isn't it?
Yeah, when I was young, right out of graduate school, I was teaching in the public schools, and I lived there 8 years. It was just a great time.
I lived there a couple years too. Anyway, so you picked out a really beautiful quilt that you would steal if it wasn't a crime. So tell us more about this quilt, and then we'll start the slides.
Well, you know, there are a lot of quilts there at your museum that I would take out if I had a chance. Let's see, Tara's going to show the first slide. It's this quilt, though, that is a recent acquisition. And she's going to get this up, I think. And it's from Chicago, and it's called Gazelle. You could go to the next one, Tara.
Well, there's that beautiful, but I think this pattern is so great. And okay, well, it was designed. It was designed by someone. It was not Bertha's original design. Tell us more what you know about this and this Winifred Avery.
Well, you know, I collect a lot of ephemera, and I've done a lot of research on patterns in the 20th century in the newspapers, lots of different places. Nancy Page, Laura Wheeler, Alice Brooks. But this is a designer I'd heard about. Her name was Winifred Avery. I've only seen one other quilt in this pattern, but I've never seen this one. I did ask Willene Smith to do a little background on it, and she has found some pretty cool stuff. But this one is called Gazelle, and I love what Winifred Avery said about it. She said something like, "Now, before you get too excited or critical of me," she said, "and think that this is a modern quilt." And now remember, this is 1933. It was published. She went on and she said she found this design on a 100-year-old antique quilt, but she said, you know, even the old people went modern, and I still think almost 100 years later, it still looks very modern, and that's what I liked about it.
Now, did Winifred tend to do kind of unusual patterns like this, or was this kind of a one-off?
Well, we've only found 6 that were published, and nowadays we could do newspapers.com, and that's what I did. And I found 6 that were published between 1929 and 1936. One is called Dandelion. It's kind of a strange quilt, but they're unusual. She did. It's a real person, unlike Laura Wheeler. This is a real person, and she did a lot of needlecraft and house projects. It was part of King Features, which was a newspaper kind of syndicate. There.
Well, it's such an amazing quilt, and honestly, you could put this in, you know, a magazine today, and you wouldn't think twice about seeing the design. It's so modern and so stylized. I just love it, and I was surprised to learn that it was a Bertha Stenge quilt because of that.
Let's go to the next one. You know, so here are the other designs that she did, and you could see that now this is Winifred Avery, and next one, she was a needlework columnist for King Features, 1929 to 1936. The one on the right, that Cherry Thieves quilt, is the only pattern I've ever seen worked up in a quilt. It'd be interesting if some of our viewers have seen some of the other ones. The next one is a camping quilt. I love the one on the right that has all the little trees around it. It was supposedly made for a boy. And has pine cones on it too. But anyway, she's not a big quilt columnist, and it wasn't shown all over the country, but it's, I think, kind of an interesting little niche in the quilt pattern history that we don't know about. But
and as we're going to see, it's very different even for Bertha, because she did a lot of traditional looking quilts, so it's kind of unusual in her body of work.
Right.
It was irresistible, evidently.
The next one. So last summer, when I knew I was going to do one of these quilt chats, I happened to be in Lincoln, and you were so kind to bring this out for me to look at closely. I knew about this quilt because I had studied Bertha Stenge, and she had about 50 quilts. There's a list that Joyce Gross and Questa Benberry had put up. A lot of people tried to find all of her quilts. And this was listed, Gazelle. And I knew that, and when I Googled, I knew there was this Winifred Avery, but I'd never seen the quilt. And actually, anyway, it ended up here at your place in Lincoln. And so last summer we looked at it, and I loved it because you spread it out. Next one, let's go. And you could see Bertha's very nice quilting on the left, and she used sateen. The color is unusual, I think, for 1933-35.
Yes.
And then on the right, you could see she's very adept at tiny applique and embroidery. And then finally, I just wanted to show the next one, Tara. On the back of her quilt, in the very center, I remember you and I looking at it and going, "Whoa, there's her name on a little woven ribbon, tiny thing in the very center of the quilt," as if, I don't know why she did that, but
thank goodness she did.
Thank goodness she did.
Yes.
So anyway, now we know it's a Bertha Stenge quilt, and I wanted to tell you that a little bit about Winifred, but I wanted to look at her, look at this quilt. I mean, I'm sorry that the International Quilt Museum doesn't have all of Bertha Stenge's quilts, but you've got a really unusual one. But let's look at her other quilts. Now,
and she's got a lot of quilts in other museums, so there is an incredible body of work that's been documented on her.
And she was known as Chicago's Quilting Queen. She had just got a lot of publicity nationwide and in her own hometown for her quilting prowess, and she was often sought out to enter contests, and they'd give her anyway. That I think that kind of thing was going on, that they really wanted some of the best quilts entered in contests. And she was born in 1891, and she had 3 children early in the 1900s, 3 daughters, and kind of an empty nest kind of thing. In 1932, she entered her first contest. It was a newspaper contest in Chicago. And her daughter, who was just 12 years old at the time, entered also. It was an alphabet quilt from Nancy Page. So they were giving a prize for the youngest entrant. The daughter won a prize.
Oh, I love that.
And Bertha won something, but not the big one. But here comes the Chicago World's Fair in 1933. And Sears is offering this huge prize for the best quilt in the nation. And if it was in the theme of the Chicago World's Fair, you got an extra $200. So Bertha, being her competitive little self, she did it. And this is her example on the right. And she called it Chicago Fair, 1933. And in the center is a circle. A lot of so there's a center medallion. And if the pictures in there, a little applique, and it starts at the top at noon with the modern quilt it's the modern building from the Chicago World's Fair. But she goes through the whole history of Chicago from 1833 to 1933. The one at the very bottom is a fire, the Chicago fire. And the one at about 8 o'clock is Fort Dearborn. She didn't win a prize, and so you could go to the next one, Tara. She went to this is quite a story, a bit of a scandal. What do you...
Yeah, we all heard about Margaret and the fact that she didn't even really make the quilts, but she was happy to take the prize.
Right. There were 4 people that she hired to work on the quilt. One did the piecing, one did the trapunto work on it, the stuffing, and the judges commented that they really liked that stuffing, the stuffed quilting. And so I think we got a picture next of the detail of how that was done. And these are actual, these little scraps came from the women who made the quilt. Barbara Brackenman and I, in the course of that book, went to visit that area of Eastern Kentucky, and one of the women still had these pieces.
Wow.
And so you could see the back. That's a part of the border that it's stuffed before it's put together with the other pieces of the quilt. So one person could work individually on the border to stuff that, so that you're looking at a white backing. On the other side of that is a dark green. And then you could see the little holes where they stuffed the cotton into those open areas.
Right.
So let's look at the next one. So Bertha, for her next contest, adds trapunto.
She was a smart cookie.
And there are all these pictures. Here she won first place in this, again, a Chicago area contest in 1936 with a quilt she called Hosanna Palm. And there she is, a pretty young woman. Let's go on to the next one.
And that's a real modern looking pattern too.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. Very well. In fact, I think this might be a mountain mist pattern called Palm. So again, well,
she had a good eye for an interesting pattern, but I love that she added that stuff work. That is so funny. She just really was not going to be beat a second time, was she?
Right. So she has a body of work of trapunto quilts, and these are 3 of them. There's a 4th one still with a granddaughter that hasn't really been photographed, but Ladies Home Journal wanted all 4 of these in their magazine. They paid her for the use of these patterns. She could not enter them in contests. But look at the dates on these, 35, 36, and 37. I think we've got a close-up of, they're all, look at the work on those quilts. There's cording in there. Basically it's cording in here. This is Iva's pincushion. I also want to point out the applique on the orange applique is a print. That is applique. The orange pieces. She's choosing colors that we don't usually associate with the 30s. Yeah. And thinking back to Gazelle, those were kind of unusual pieces.
They were. There's a bright pink and a kind of a maroon that we just don't see in other quilts. She really liked that polished cotton too, didn't she? That background, just like in Gazelle, has that beautiful sheen to it.
Let's go to the next one. So in 1940, she entered another World's Fair contest, and look which quilt she entered. It's the one that she made in 1936 with the trapunto, and she's now calling it palm leaf. She won in New York, and her story got all over the nation through the wire service. So she is really getting a national reputation for her trapunto, for her quilt.
Well, you know, Merikay, let's back up for just a second. What made you, or how did you discover Bertha? What got you started on all of this research on her particularly?
Well, I think it was probably Joyce Gross. But I mean, since I lived in Chicago and I loved Chicago, you know, Barbara Brackman also lived in Chicago. She arrived there a couple of years after I left in 77. And she's the one who picked up on the Sears Quilt Contest. And then, and there were all these names of people who had entered the contest. She followed those along. Joyce Gross, another determined little quilt historian, a little older than we were and a lot more free time, retired. She went around the country and she ended up meeting Prudence Fuchsman, that's Bertha Stenge's daughter. And she just became fascinated with Bertha. So we had that access to Bertha's story through Joyce. Joyce wrote about her in Quilt Journal. I think Barbara wrote about Bertha Stenge in early uncoverings. So let's see. Well, at one point, I can't remember now exactly, but I know. Frances. Well, anyway, I went to Chicago, I guess because we were writing the Patchwork Souvenirs, and I thought, I'm going to track this down myself. I know Chicago. I know where these addresses are. I know where her granddaughters are, and her daughters were alive at the time. I actually went with a friend who was a photographer on a Saturday morning. We photographed all of Frances Trainor's quilts. She's the oldest daughter, and all of Prudence Fuchsman's quilts. And she had this huge box of ephemera that Joyce had already seen. Even Sally Garoot had already been there and taken notes. And then I went to visit her one granddaughter, Carolyn Golden, and she had, so a lot of the quilt photos that you see that I'm sharing today are from that Saturday.
Wow.
And then the letters, oh my gosh, she wrote to Florence Pito. Florence Pito wrote to her. Florence is writing to other women like Emma Andrus out in New Mexico. And you put all these little pieces together. Suddenly, I knew more about Bertha Stenge and her life, especially her quilting life, than her own daughters. And both daughters have since passed away. And that's why some of these quilts have gotten out onto the market. We'll keep going. And that's I just love these. She's a regular quilt maker. I mean, it's like, you know how people love to do little, I don't, but
I don't either. But look at it. I mean, she's just one of those quilters that just puts things together in a really unique way. The blocks aren't different, but the composition is so striking.
She was a stained glass artist. That's what she was trained in school in San Francisco. The quilt on the left was published, Star of Constantine. It's very similar to one that was in Ruth Finley's book that is modeled on a quilt that was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think there are 2 more of these. It's just amazing. And most of these you see right here are now in the Illinois State Museum. So she also made some wonderful embroidery and applique. I call them albums. And this is from a quilt that doesn't photograph very well because it's white and has these little individual little pieces. So this is just one. And it's called One Woman's Life. And there's her signature, Bertha Stenge. And that's her on the right. And notice, well, it just does very innovative.
And it looks like her. It really does. I mean, after seeing those pictures, it really does. Yeah. It just, obviously, she's really skilled.
Yeah. So these are some in that grouping, that category, again, that she made. Now, the one in the center, you probably recognize because it's the one that she won. She is probably best known. It's called the Quilt Show. Took her more than 1 year. It's now owned by the Chicago Art Institute, and I think they have a date of 1943. So, you know, that makes sense. Took her a long time to make that. And then on the right is American Holidays. In a letter, she actually says it took 4 or 5 years to finish that. The one on the left is still owned by her granddaughter, who now lives out in Arizona, but it's called Ladies of Fashion. And I have some close-ups of these.
And you discovered, because I had asked when we were talking before, if you thought that Bertha quilted all of her quilts, because when we see someone making this many quilts, you do wonder. And you discovered some interesting information about that.
And that was, again, that was Joyce Gross who discovered it, or found it first in the letters. And it's not that uncommon for even today. I mean, it's very common today for somebody to be really good at the top and then send it out to be quilted. And that she was doing that in Indiana and Illinois. I reread the letters. I have photocopies of them, and it's hard to tell which quilt she was talking about. Or the quilter was saying, well, here it is, and this is what it's going to cost. They were just like little receipts that went back and forth. But yeah, she was not completing the whole quilt.
Well, you know, that's so, I really do think people like to either create the top or do the quilting. There's oftentimes they don't like to do both. So that's not uncommon at all, but interesting.
So here's a detail of this American Holidays quilt. And again, I'm pretty sure she did all, as an artist, I really think she's the one who created these designs. Maybe she was using, she could have been using photographs. But anyway, they're just.
So do you think early on she was doing more patterns that she found in newspapers, but then developed her own designs?
Well, I think she was doing it parallel, because you'll see those later on. She did a kit in the 50s. I think she was just doing it all. But I think she probably liked these little applique ones the best. I think this one is cool because it's St. Valentine's Day, and it's from that quilt. And you could see again the work that she was doing with lace and with embroidery, tiny lettering. And then out of the mailbox comes this little letter with Bertha Stenge on it. And she's used the very same little woven ribbon that's on the back of your museum's quilt.
I love that.
I think that's pretty cool. I like making those connections. I don't know. I get excited about that.
Well, it's really fun to see those connections, and that's what really tells a story.
Yeah. So this quilt
Oh my
on the left
gosh.
has never been seen publicly. The last time I saw it was when we were at AQSG in Phoenix. Not, it wasn't Phoenix, but anyway, the most recent one in Arizona. The granddaughter still lives out there, and this is behind. She has it. She's an artist herself. Very, very fond of her grandmother's work. She was very close to her grandmother. This quilt is behind plexiglass on the wall, and it's really an incredible piece. But each one of those little album things is like they're askew. They're kind of like pages from a book, which is exactly what they were. They're little charts. It's a history of costume design. And so I've got a plate on and Carolyn, the granddaughters, does still have the book. And so what we did was take pictures of the plates and then found the actual plate on the book just to compare.
Wow.
Well, what she was doing with the applique. So
the detail is so amazing.
It's a 2-volume book, kind of an unusual book. Maybe our costume friends will know more about it. Now, here are her published patterns she actually used.
Oh.
And there's nothing on these quilts that so far, well, now this is interesting. Yours right in the center does have that little plate on it. Knowing that Bertha had help with the quilting makes me feel better.
Definitely makes me feel better.
That's great. Anyway, the lotus blossom on the left is a Mrs. Danner's quilt pattern from Kansas. Then your Gazelle newspaper pattern. The one on the upper right is the Bible quilt. I've seen several other renditions of that, but and it was lost like yours. We didn't know where it was, and it has surfaced recently. And then in the bottom right is that kit that came out, in the 50s? I should know that right off the top of my head, but I don't. Now, that is not her. I mean, I took the picture of that quilt, but that's not her quilt. I mean, that's a quilt made from that pattern. We have the label, but we don't have her quilt. So anyway, we're still looking for that one in the bottom right. And here is Ladies' Home Journal. Wow. Her quilt on the left, and the actual Ladies' Home Journal page in color, published in August 1938. And each one of those, you could kind of see how they connected. But
that's quite the design for a Bible quilt. The big elephant, the giraffe, the camel.
And somebody needs to know who the designer of this was. Worked for Ladies' Home Journal. Boy, at first I thought, could Bertha have been the designer?
Oh, that's an interesting idea.
So in 1954, here we have Florence Peto, the famous quilt collector, and she was the grande dame of the quilt circle. She went all over the country. I mean, she could talk to anybody, but she was sought after for developing quilt collections on the East Coast. She was involved in the Index of American Design, and she was an amazing letter writer. Well, she heard about Bertha Stenge, and she struck up a pen pal relationship with her. And so when I think it was Bertha, well, anyway, somehow Bertha was invited to do a one-woman show at this exhibit. It was the Women's Exposition Conference again in New York City. So all of her 33 of her quilts were on display, and you could see the one in the back of them is again that little hexagon thing, but they're looking at her Bible quilt. So we know by looking at this black and white picture that which one is Bertha? Bertha is on the right. That's good. And Florence is on the left. Anyway, there, and you can kind of see in the black and white picture that it looks like it's shiny.
Very shiny.
And so then when we actually found the quilt, it is shiny. What's the blue fabric? It is, I think it's
another polished cotton.
It's more than, I think it's more. I haven't seen this. It did end up at the Illinois State Museum. I think the next picture might be the better picture. Maybe not. No. Anyway, it's at the Illinois State Museum.
I wonder if it's silk.
I think it's, see her, it's the same fabric as her jacket. Very slick, kind of a heavy, kind of a satin. Oh, maybe
Well, by 54, it could have been a synthetic too, so who knows? But boy, the quilting is amazing. And on her jacket.
Yeah, it's pretty. I've never seen it, but you could look at it online too at Illinois. I'm pretty sure it's in their collection catalog. So Florence, being Florence, decides that she's going to have some kind of influence on these Midwest quilt makers. And she starts, she decides that, you know, I'm going to give you my vintage fabrics or pieces of it, chintz, all kinds of things. I want to see what you do with it. And Florence tried the same thing. So together they were making similar quilts. And then she said to Bertha, why don't you try one of the medallion style? You've never made one like that. And so let's see the next picture. She did. The quilt on the left ends up, that's the quilt that Florence Pito encouraged Bertha to make. And so Bertha uses vintage fabrics for all those borders and takes an old photo and makes it into applique. And that quilt is her signature piece, along with the quilt, show quilt. It became, you know, those are the two quilts of hers of the 20th century. She's one of two people that actually got two quilts that she made listed in the 20th century best 100 quilts.
Now, is that the famous painting that she's reproducing in the center?
Yeah, in a minute we've got a little picture of that. So okay, here is that quilt on the left, and there's the picture.
Right.
And then if the quilt on the right, here we go with the connection to you recognize it?
Irene Post, I do.
Irene Post was Bertha's neighbor. Here she is on the right. And the quilt, she too has been influenced by Florence. Now they were living right next to each other. So maybe, who knows who started it, but maybe Bertha was making one, Irene decides to make one. Irene's is vertical, Florence's is horizontal. But look at the photo that
was a magazine cover, wasn't it?
It was
Life magazine, or
maybe I'm not sure. I thought at first it was a calendar. Now, how did I meet this? How did I come upon these quilts? Now, I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and this woman from Southern Ohio, Sue Cummings, I think she was a member of AQSG.
Yes, she was.
Calls me one day and says she and her husband had been to an auction and they bought all these things from that had a connection to Chicago. And she said one of her quilts looks a lot like Bertha Stenge's famous quilt. And she sent me a picture. I went, whoa, it does. And then she started telling me what was in the box that came with these quilts. I think she bought, I don't know. Well, you know, they all.
There's 6 quilts and 2 tops, I believe.
they all ended up coming to your museum.
Yes.
And it's thrilling. I mean, we at AQSG, these are some of the top on the left, and I think that's pretty. It is a top, and you don't buy top, or you don't take tops very often, do you?
When it comes in with a collection like that, it's an important piece. Random ones, they're just harder to display. So, the funny thing is that the Post family just came and visited us, a month or two ago. Her great-granddaughter or granddaughter, I can't remember which, and she started out kind of salty when we talked, because she said those quilts were never meant to be sold out of the family. And I said, well, they came from Sue as a part of her collection. And of course, Sue is known for her quilts of Miami Valley, Ohio. And I said, so we were talking, and this woman she just kind of kept pressuring me about how we had them. And I finally said, if it hadn't been for Sue buying them all and saving all that material, they would have been gone and out to anybody. And she kind of thought, you're right. But she still kept trying to convince me to trade her a quilt for the farm quilt, because she really wanted that one back. And I thought,
oh my God,
can't do that. But so we bonded after a little while, but boy, it took some talking.
Well, I think Irene and her husband moved to Southern Ohio in about 1951.
They were originally, I think, from Ohio. And then for some reason, I think her husband's job took them to Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And then as soon as, I don't remember exactly why, but maybe after her husband retired, they moved back to Ohio because they wanted to go back to the farm. Evidently, Irene did not like the big city.
Right.
At least that's what I was told.
Right. So when they passed away, the husband and wife, I think it was the woman who got the house, who had the auction. And that's how Sue Cummings. I think this is Sue Cummings herself. I'm going to ask her husband. Sue is a wonderful person. She did some really wonderful, she's passed away in the last few years. Yeah. And her husband has given money for a grant for people to do research through the AQSG. He's just a great guy. I've talked to him a lot. He really misses Sue. And she was a professor at Ohio University, College. She was great in genealogy. I encouraged her to write this story up. She said, oh, it's too small, being a neighbor of Bertha Stenge. So if you look, it did get written, it did get accepted, and it's in the 2008 volume of Uncoverings. So here is Sue, I think. What happened was that the exhibit of Bertha Stenge quilts that had gone to the Illinois State Museum, Jan Wass was the curator at the time, and she mounted this exhibit. There are about 15 of her Stenge's quilts on display altogether. So this was the first time so many of them were on display. And look at the size of we saw these before. I don't think it was clear how big these quilts are. They really are pretty amazing. Okay, let's keep going. We're kind of coming. We've gone over, well, how Bertha became Chicago's quilting queen. She won prizes. We talked a little bit about, but let's go on to the next one. How did Chicago become the hotbed of quilting in the 30s?
This is so interesting. It is. It's just such so many quilters from that area have come out. It's really interesting.
Well, of course, I think it was a place where a lot of things were published, and there was a lot of pattern making going on there. So that's, the industry was in place. And then Sears was headquartered in Chicago, and they announced this big quilt contest, $1,000 prize for the best quilt made in the nation, to go along with the big Chicago World's Fair that attracted millions of people in 1933, the depths of the Depression. And then there was this radio station called WLS, still exists in Chicago, and it was an arm or part of Sears Roebuck and Company. WLS stands for World's Largest Store. Sears logo in 1933. They offered all kinds of advice and gave out free patterns at their 6 stores throughout Chicago. So, and then the result was lots of quilts being made in Chicago, but nationwide there were 24,000 quilts. So let's go on.
You know, it's kind of like the Mountain Mist story too, where they were really getting the quilts out to department stores and doing a lot of demonstrations and giveaways, and that really had a huge impact. So Sears was kind of, I don't know who was first, but that idea of making quilts so fashionable by putting them in the department store.
I think I'd give Mountain Mist that, but Sears was really on it, you know. And 4 months though, the people had 4 months to make these quilts.
Wow.
This is Sue Roberts. She too is quite a woman. Sue Roberts changed her name to Sue Roberts for Sears Roebucks. So anyway, she just was modern, and she hosted this daily radio program, and basically it said, okay, here we all are, open your catalog. You know, we're going to look on page 75. We're going to talk about this new thing in the catalog. But she was always promoting, at least that winter of 33, the contest.
Oh my gosh, we used to love when those catalogs would come when we were kids. We'd go to the toy section and start picking out what we wanted.
So the contest happened, and you could see here on the picture on the left, the 3 top winners from the nation were pretty standard designs, traditional. And then on the right are the top regional winners. And again, there's a couple in there that were pretty modern, but now the judges throughout the country did not particularly like the original designs. And Sears had offered this $200 bonus if it was in the theme of the Century of Progress. And today, let's look at those. The next one. These are the kinds of quilts that were made in Chicago. And if you were living in Chicago that year and excited about this fair, you probably interpreted the theme as the fair itself. And you could see it here in this picture was taken in 1934, when kind of to be nice, Sue Roberts organized this exhibit of the also-rans.
Well, wasn't that in part because Ida Stowe, whose quilt is in the very center at the back, was pretty vocal about not getting chosen as a winner?
You see her quilt in the back. That's exactly right. And today, next picture, today, this quilt is in your collection thanks to Robert and artist James.
Yes, it is.
It is spectacular. Barbara and I were here in Knoxville for the exhibit for some reason, but we were getting ready for the book was out. We got a call from California, and a man said, I have the Ida Stowe quilt. See, we didn't even know what color it was. We didn't even know what it looked like. We had her letter, and it turns out that letter, where she is angry about the contest, went to Bertha Stenge, and Bertha had the letter in her box.
That's how you got the letter. We have the letter now with the quilt, but I didn't realize that's how they got connected.
It's incredible. There was a P.S. at the bottom on the letter in Bertha's collection, and it's you know, she's saying, I'm so mad at this. You know, I was so mad. I went and told them I didn't think Mrs. Roosevelt would be happy with this. Well, anyway, so I said. So I called immediately. I said, well, how do you know it's an Ida Stowe quilt? And he said, it's in the back of your book. You know, this man in California had the book. And I said, will you send us a picture? You know, I still didn't believe him. And when he sent the picture, Barbara Brackman had already left. It was the quilt that was in the center of that black and white picture I just showed you. Wow. And I called Artis and Bob, and I said, you know, we've got to have this quilt. And they did. They bought it on the spot. The man sent it to Knoxville. We showed it in Knoxville on a slant board. It did not travel with the rest of the quilts around the world,
Yeah, it's so fragile.
It is.
It's unfortunate. She did it all out of silk, and the background is actually splitting. And what you can't see in the photo is the ridiculously intricate and gorgeous quilting that is like the history of transportation. And so it's just got the most, my favorite part of it is the elevated train in Chicago, the L. And she's actually kind of got a station with the train on the track. I mean, it's so intricate. It's just phenomenal. And it's really sad because we can't show it very often because it's so fragile.
And you know, Quilt Folk just did an issue on Illinois. And a photograph of this quilt is in there, and it is excellent. You could really see the embroidery.
Yeah, they do such beautiful photos, and their reproductions are great. Yeah.
So then the next one I think is also in your collection.
Yes, Emma Leonards.
She's from Illinois, not far from Chicago. And when you look at hers, she too is, and compare it to what Bertha was doing. She chose sateen. Her quilting is amazing. This quilt is like an album, like Bertha had done. Emma is focusing on several things here. It's the history of costume. Again, I pulled one up in the upper right. It's a 1933 modern woman. But I think that Emma was focusing on a block. And here, I pulled that up too. I think a lot of people were hoping that Sears the winner would be a block that would commemorate the fair. And hers kind of does it. You know, it goes from the cabin to the skyscraper.
The skyscraper.
It didn't win. It didn't even, I think it got an honorable mention, but it didn't go.
And she did all that crazy quilting too, where so many people seem to do those designs in the quilting, which in some cases, we have another one, a quilt that's a calendar quilt. It's got all that beautiful quilting, but unfortunately, like Emma did it in a contrasting color, as did Ida. This other quilt, she didn't. So it almost disappears, and it's so elaborate.
Yeah. I just found out that she was known. It's written, it's in Patchwork Souvenirs, but it didn't connect with me. She was a birder. I'm a major birder now. And she was head of the Illinois Audubon Society. There's a bird sanctuary in her name outside of Jackson.
Oh.
She also was into Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and that's in the corners. You could see that also. I think the Girl Scout is in the upper right. Something that I think a lot of too. Okay, now the Nancy.
Mary Kay, I'm just going to warn you. It's almost 10 till, so
we'll go through this quick.
Lots to show, but.
The Nancy Cabot quilt column began in 1932. And like I was saying, it was Chicago Tribune. They were hoping that there would be a block saying Century of Progress. And in fact, they got permission to do it from the World's Fair people. And this is the block on the right. It was published in October that fall. And when they realized that the quilts wouldn't have a quilt block, they went ahead and had their designers do one. So here is a quilt made of it. It's made by Mary Gasperik. She's somebody that I've studied a lot, and she's from Chicago, the South Side. Turns out we could go to the next one. She and Bertha were really competing for the same space.
They had quite a competition, didn't they?
Yes. And Chicago, represented there at the upper right, had active quilting clubs at their parks all over the city. The Thule Park Quilting Club was especially active. And there's Mary in the upper right, the second from the left, and they're standing in front of Mary's quilt, a laurel wreath. And like Stenge, I think she got a lot of, who knows where they got their ideas from, but Mary embellished on a standard pattern. That's a Nancy Page pattern, but she put birds on it and other flowers.
Yeah.
And then this one, oh, wow.
Such a stunning piece.
This is oh my gosh, there are so few quilts made completely from the Nancy Cabot line. It was very focused in Chicago. But this woman, Rose Modjeska, wow. When I realized that's exactly what it is, she did an excellent job. And I love that your genealogist found out her background. She too was maybe second generation, but she married a Russian immigrant. And
if I remember correctly, the center of this quilt has just incredibly tiny quilt, like a grid quilting design, like an oval shape that is just phenomenal.
It's like Emma Leonards that we saw before. Now the next one, I think we're right at the end. Bertha Mcstroth is quite a funny woman.
Very unique,
Very
definitely.
Unique. She graduated from Radcliffe in, I think, 1904. She didn't marry. She lived in Glencoe. Her sister married a Sears executive, and she lived there at his house, at their house. And she made many quilts, a couple hundred quilts. This one, I think she made 4 copies of this very quilt.
Wow.
They're intricate applique. And anyway.
And I think it's all like one piece. She
right.
cut it out in one piece, the whole design out of one piece of fabric.
She was a sculptor. And she considered this working with quilts. It's like Wedgwood. In fact, she even called this one Deer in Wedgwood. Go ahead. Here's a couple more from your collection. Now we
were really lucky to get a group of them from a collector who just could hardly bear to part with them. Most of them are very much more in a kind of a religious kind of tone, very heavy silks and a lot of gold and silver. She's very unique.
We don't have maybe the next one. No, we don't, but a lot of them are writing, like Gothic.
Applique lettering in script, really.
So she had her quilts, she's very proud of it, exhibited at the fair. And she gave 2 lectures, one in July and one in October, and got quite a reputation for that. I'm really glad they're there. I really think somebody ought to spend some time with it. So
yeah, I do too.
I think we're at the end here, and going to the next one, just as a dispersal. So, if this quilt had I guess what I was doing here was to kind of say, well, I'm surprised it's here. I'm glad it's at your museum. Let's look at, where it falls in her lifetime. And where it is in her body of work. And just to kind of review quickly the dispersal of her quilts. She died in June of 1957. The Historical Society of Chicago got Chicago Fair, and she gave it to them when she was alive. Smithsonian got Life's Flower Basket. That was her last quilt, and I think she gave it to them before she died. And then this quilt called Toby Lill, again, with a lot of chintz in it, went to the Art Institute of Chicago. And then some quilts, while Bertha was still alive, were given away to people outside the family or sold to friends. And I think that's where, isn't there a name with it?
There is. Someone contacted us about us and asked if we wanted to have the quilt. So I think it was one that probably left the family's hands.
Right. And the remaining quilts were divided among her 3 daughters, 12 to each one. And they were Ruth, Frances, and Prudence. So Ruth died early in the 30s, and her quilts are divided among her 3 daughters. So and then Frances never had children, and at her death, they went to Prudence, but they were immediately sold either to Joyce Gross or to the Illinois State Museum. And then Prudence sold some of hers, and they were back in the 70s. Some were acquired that way by Joyce Gross, and then quite a few were donated to the Art Institute. And today, Quilt Show and American Holidays are at the Art Institute. Joyce Gross's quilts, that's between the Illinois State Museum and then Joyce Gross's quilts, all went to the University of Texas at Briscoe Center. So they're in nice places, very nice places that are going to be protected and able for people to research them.
Well, and I think the other fascinating thing, and I know you love this so much, Merikay, is just all of the ephemera that has come along with these, and that has been saved to really tell her story. And so much of the paperwork that we receive is now at our special collection and archives, and you can go to the University of Nebraska site under special collections at the library and find some of those finding aids and see who has given archives and what they studied. So there's some amazing information. That's where Sue Cummings' research is housed now, is there. And her research on the Miami Valley quilts, like you said, she was an amazing genealogist. And we're talking 20-some quilts that all had probably 20 or 30 names on each of them. And she just did amazing research and kept everything. She was so organized. So do you know if the quilters did keep any notebooks or journals documenting their quilt making?
Well, Bertha did. What is in her papers are, she had appraisals done. That's
nice.
Interesting. And when she had those one-woman shows at University of California, there's a list of the ones that were there. And then also, so that's a way to date where when the quilts were made. But as far as
that is amazing.
I don't think of any other. No.
It's just such a fascinating thing because these regional styles really do. It's something we see starting in the 1900s. Just something about maybe the way people talked about, or in the 1900s, I don't think they were publicizing quilts, but somehow just by the sheer force of making quilts and other people seeing them, they really developed these strong regional hotbeds. Right. And Chicago is just one of the hugest. It's amazing.
I think that the state fairs were an opportunity to display your quilt, to exhibit your quilts. In Detroit, where Mary Gasperik went, that annual quilt show was a really big event. 1,000 quilts were shown those years, and in the 30s up until till the war years, World War II. Another very large exhibit near Chicago was the Central States Exposition, and it was kind of a Midwest-centered fair. The Sterleton Fair in Massachusetts was really, it was the predecessor of the Sears National Quilt Contest. It had been going on for at least 2 years before the Sears one. I think Sears saw it and realized that people would send quilts, and
they had no idea how many they would end up getting. That's amazing. Well, gosh, Merikay, this has been so fun, and just goes to show how that fascination with quilts and research kind of just builds and builds. And I love that people get to know you, and then they start to send you that information, and they start to realize you're somebody that they need to talk to about their papers or their quilts. And so it just keeps kind of multiplying and multiplying.
And I mean, we got to credit a place like AQSG. I mean, I was thinking about it today, the number of years and the amount of the knowledge that's in the book, the knowledge that's in all the members, and the networking that has gone on through the years. I think about the people who are no longer here, but they left a legacy, and I really encourage people to go back and read those books.
That's where we start all of our research. When people call, we get constant calls like that from students who want to know how to research quilts. And I always say, the first thing you got to do is go to the American Quilt Study Group, because the bibliographies, the fact that it was something that was peer reviewed, means that you've got such high quality research and great resources. So it really is. It's an absolute amazing legacy, and I hope people will still continue to keep writing papers and contributing. Merikay, it's 3 o'clock. That means our time is up. Gosh, we could talk all day. I always say this when we do these chats, but it is so fun to talk to people, and especially someone who's so passionate about research. We are not going to be having a QUILTSIDE chat in November or December, a little too close to the holidays. But we'll be back in January on the 16th, and Tara Miller is going to be my guest that day, and we're going to talk about Jean Ray Laurie, which is really exciting. We were fortunate, again, to have not only about 40 of Jean Ray's quilts, but an incredible archive that her family donated along with the quilts, with all of her teaching materials and her patterns, and just lots and lots of bits and pieces that tell her story. And there's a research project for someone that we need to get done. So, well, thanks so much, Merikay. And
thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Carolyn, for everything you've done.
Oh, thank you. I can't say it's anything but fun, really. I mean, I get bogged down in the day-to-day now and then, but wow, what a fabulous job. And it's just always so fascinating. And I absolutely love the way all this history always kind of, you just start with one thing and then it just fits into that bigger picture, and you can find, you know, you can take quilts any direction you want to go, whether it's technology or history or these women or whatever. That's what I love about it. So, and I know you do too. And all of us here at AQSG do. So. Well, thanks, everybody, and we will see you again in the new year. Hard to believe, but enjoy. And don't forget the Know-It-Alls on Wednesdays. There's another program that is an incredible wealth of information and knowledge in all of you. So definitely sign up for that and follow them, too. So bye, everybody.
Bye.